I want to turn back to my panel here in New York. Mike Pesca, Lynette Lopez, Philippe Reines, Mike Memoli, along with Rolling Stone senior writer Jamil Smith, whose latest piece for that magazine digs into why it's time for Joe to go, in his estimation. He writes, if defeating Trump in 2020 is as important to Biden as he so often claims, he should end his campaign and remove himself from contention for president. Jamil, let me start there, have to react to what the former senator had to say. Your piece centers on the fact that we need, in your estimation, an anti-racist president. Help us understand what you mean by that.
Well, I think, David, you saw early on in Barack Obama's presidency the urgency with which the right approached his election. Essentially, they thought it was an emergency. They thought that it was something that they needed to address with a Tea Party movement. They thought it was something that they needed to, essentially, call all arms, essentially, to say, we need to, make sure that someone is crazy and as radical as Donald Trump, it could actually be considered as president. And we need to, I think, on the left, consider it just as much an emergency. And that doesn't mean we need to, elect someone as unqualified and as unprepared for the office as Donald Trump just because, we have him available. But we need to really consider this as a national emergency. We need to address it with that kind of urgency. And frankly, I don't see the Democrats doing that. What I see them doing is rushing to choose a candidate who is, I guess fits the stereotypical picture of what a president they think looks like. And I see, frankly, a lot of black voters choosing a candidate who they think white voters will choose. And that is unfortunate.
Mike Pesca, let me turn to you. Let's go back to Thursday night. How disqualifying was the response to that question that he was asked? Again, responding to something he said 40 years ago, asked to talk about his evolution of views since then and sort of where he sees that in the history of our country.
It was only disqualifying. I mean, we live in a democracy, so people have to decide. It's only disqualifying insofar as it highlighted his biggest problem, which is that he has, however you want to say it, lost a step, lost some miles on his fastball, or to put it plainly, I think it's pretty clear he's experiencing mild cognitive decline, and that's not the kind of person who you want going up against Donald Trump or leading the country. And everything else comes after that is a bit of a Rorschach test. I read the entire Rolling Stone article. I think it's extremely unfair when in the headline you say that we need an anti-racist and Joe Biden isn't that. I know how double negatives work, and you're implying that Joe Biden is a racist. You're approvingly quoting a tweet saying that this isn't the new style of racism. This is, 1950s casual racism, and that Joe Biden's mask has slipped. And I also understand. I know you're shaking your head, but I also understand what the anti-racism rhetoric means. Well, I'll just finish my point, which is that the anti-racism rhetoric now means, it's Ibram Zendi who wrote a book about how to be an anti-racist, which means we always have to fight racism. I think it's a Rorschach test. He had a word salad. You're reading into that racism. Joe Biden isn't a racist.
Jamil, I'll have you respond to that. I mean, I look at what you wrote. I look at what Ryan Grimm wrote. Ryan Grimm, writing for The Intercept, says the blatant racism in that answer has not received the scrutiny it deserves. I'm struck by how in your piece and in his piece, you both include the transcript of it. I mean, it's one thing to listen to it. It's a startling thing to listen to. It's another thing to read as well. But I'll have you respond to what Mike said there about anti-racism.
All right. Well, first things first. With regard to Ibram Kendi's book, not Ibram Zendi, I think that what Ibram writes in his book is that you need to have people who are not just not racist, but actively anti-racist. And so it's not just enough to say that you're not racist. You have to have people who are actively working towards the goal of eliminating racism. And so I think in this case, you're working against a white nationalist incumbent. I think that, of all cases, this is an obvious case where you need somebody who is a nominee who is not only conversant in the language of anti-racism, but actively practicing it. So it's not about whether or not somebody is called a racist. Let's get out of that conversation now, okay? It is not about whether or not Joe Biden is a racist. Let's stop that, okay? We're talking about whether or not he knows and understands the practice of anti-racism. And we have a bunch of candidates here who frankly, know that language and practice a lot better than he does.
Lynette, I want to ask you about the polling involved here. Jamil is making this case. Why would Joe Biden change? Why would he leave if he looks at those polling numbers and sees them as solid, sees that he's still the front runner here?
That is something you'd have to talk to his campaign about, but I would say that my favorite part of Jamil's piece was the word vocabulary. The vocabulary around anti-racist over the last 15 years has changed. And if you are a student of anti-racism, you understand how the movement is currently talking about things like mass incarceration, about what we need for our communities, about intersectionality. These are all words that people in Biden's generation might not be familiar with. They are the vanguard of how our communities think about fighting racism. If you are a committed anti-racist, then you are studying these words. You are studying what the community wants to put forward. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump is a racist. I've made that very clear.
You have made that point on the show, yeah.
And I would never say that Joe Biden is a racist. I don't think he is. I think that he is somebody who has become very comfortable with how he thinks about race, and that is a level of understanding of our communities and our understandings of ourselves and how we want to push America forward. It is 15 to 20 years old, if not 30. And as a young person, it is difficult for me to see people like Julian Castro, like Cory Booker, who are trying to embrace our understanding of what the community needs and what racism is, because racism has changed. The language of the alt-right has changed. The way that they congregate and what they want and what they've been pushing for politically, that has evolved. The black community has evolved also. The Latino community has evolved also. And so what I think Jamil is trying to say here is that Biden has not been part of that evolution at all. And it is disappointing to young people to see that he has been able to kind of skate by without doing his homework on our community.
Philippe, I want you to weigh in here lastly, and let's talking about this evolution. And you have a vice president, a candidate here who seems like he wants or sees the need to evolve. The likelihood of that happening, you've been in the room with him before. How did you process what unfolded here over the last week?
Well, I think you have a couple of things. First, to Jamil's piece, which I read the other night, I thought was over the top, not in his criticism, but in his remedy. To say that this is disqualifying and that Joe Biden should leave the race, that is a very serious thing. It's also seemingly contrary to half of blacks being polled in the Democratic Party. Separately, Lynette's point is the right point, which is who is best to deal with this going forward? Is a 77-year-old man the best white man, the best person to do it? Is a 78-year-old white man the best person to do it? Is a 70-year-old white woman the best to do it? Meanwhile, the three of them account for 60% of the Democratic vote at the moment. Now, Senator Mosley Braun said something very interesting, which I think is the real political key to this. And she said it a couple of times, which is that Joe Biden has been pushed on his back foot about this. He's in Alabama today. It's the 56th anniversary of the bombing. That means he was 21 when it happened. You can look at that two ways. He's either old as dirt or he's really been through the battles. And when I look at Joe Biden, look, he could sit here with us and he wouldn't say, "Oh, Philippe, it's good to see you again. I saw you in the, in the Situation Room 10 years ago." But I've been around him enough, especially in the Senate, to know this is someone in his 49, 50 years in public service has done what he can to make life better for Americans, white Americans, black Americans, Hispanic Americans, any people of color, anyone living in this country. If it is not as fast or as efficient or as correct in terms of his lexicon, that is a function of his age and his generation. People are going to individually have to decide whether he is best able to do it in this age. I think it's pretty clear who is and who isn't, but Jamil, he doesn't get to disqualify people.
Right. Jamil, I want to give you the last word on all of this, going back to Mike's. I mean, I would say everybody here read the piece, enjoyed the piece, took something from the piece, but I want you to respond to what Mike said and what Philippe's saying here as well. You're making this leap, you're calling for this, there is this call to action in the piece. Help us understand how you decided to do that, why you think that's the remedy, especially before this speech that we're going to hear in just a few minutes.
Well, listen, something that went unmentioned the other night was that Friday, September 13th, was the 25th anniversary of President Clinton signing into law the 1994 crime bill. And so if we're going to judge, as Carol Moseley Braun says, Joe Biden on his past, then we should judge the totality of it. And if we're going to judge Joe Biden on, all of his record, we should judge all of it. And we shouldn't just judge Joe Biden on, the parts that they want to judge us on, have him judge us on. And frankly, we shouldn't judge a presidential candidate based upon his past anyway. We should judge the presidential candidate on what they're going to do in the future. What are they? The black community is basically being asked to accept Joe Biden on what we already know about him, and not what he's going to do for us in the future. And that, given what we have in the situation right now, is exactly the wrong thing. We have somebody in office that frankly, if he's going to replace Donald Trump, he's going to have to fix a whole lot of stuff. And frankly, he seems very ill-equipped, both in terms of rhetoric and in terms of policy. And he's proving that often, that he's not the right person to do it. And if he's not the right person to do it, and he says that it is, in fact, important that we get this person replaced, he should step aside. And if that to me is the patriotic thing to do. And I'm not the one saying that I should be the only person deciding this. I'm just recommending a course of action.
The recommendation in that piece in Rolling Stone, which I commend to everybody. Jamil Smith, thank you very much for coming on the show to talk.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.